Testing, testing, testing. Can
Yes,
anyone
ma'am. We
hear me?
can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. Okay, great. We're set then, I think.
Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, can we start our session now?
Yes, we can start.
Okay. Good afternoon and namaskar to everyone. I am Ayush, representing Voices from the Periphery. It's both a privilege and an honor to welcome you all to today's lecture on fake news and the British East India Company, disinformation in the early modern world. We are deeply fortunate to have with us the distinguished Professor Margaret Hunt. Professor Hunt is a distinguished social, cultural, and gender historian specializing in early modern Europe. With a diverse academic background spanning music, theology, and history, her scholarly pursuits explore European overseas trade and settlement, military and maritime history, legal regimes, and identify formation with a particular focus on Britain and South Asia. She has authored seminal works including The Middling South, 1996, awarded the Maurice D. Forkosch Prize, Women in 18th-century Europe, which broadened the historiographical scope of women's history by incorporating diverse cultural and legal context. Her co-edited volume, The English East India Company at the Height of Mughal Expansion, highlights her commitment to global and transactional historical narratives. Dr. Hunt is currently working on a book examining the human impact on Northeast European commercial expansion, drawing on her extensive research into legal and maritime archives. Thank you, ma'am.
Do you want me to use the PowerPoint? I mean, I can.
Yes, ma'am. You can
do it
just
without.
share the screen and use the PowerPoint.
Okay, let's see. Present now. Okay, let me just find this. Well, it doesn't seem to be doing it yet, but let me just give it another different try. Because I just switched to a new computer, I think I'll just deliver it as is. I mean, it's not absolutely crucial to have the PowerPoint, though. You know, it's always nice to have pretty pictures. But why don't I just go ahead, because I think it will take too long to pull it up. Is that all right with you? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, let me begin then. And first, let me say thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to always to speak to audiences in India, a country I love very much. And I'm going to generally talk about fake news, but fake news mainly in the 17th century, but there's obviously lots of analogs to today, and we can perhaps talk about those in the Q&A. So then let me begin. It is actually surprisingly difficult to say exactly what fake news is. The definition most people start with is making up and transmitting news stories known to be false. This may suggest something important about how some factually challenged stories get started, but it does not do justice to the problem of demonstrably untrue claims that are nevertheless believed, including by those who start them, and passed off as true, which is at least some of the fake news that we see today. Once a story is believed to be true, as opposed to known to be false, is it any longer fake news? There are also questions of genre. How do we square the notion of fake news with conspiracy theories, which circulate widely, but are for the most part generated by people who believe, however benightedly, what they are saying? And how about news that is deliberately designed to be parodic, but then goes viral as true? The Onion, a Chicago based humor site, formerly a print magazine, was the original source for the now iconic parody news article of July 2000. I'm quoting from the title here: Harry Potter books spark rise in Satanism among children. And in my PowerPoint, I had an image of that, but you don't need to really see it. But that parody about how Harry Potter books were supposedly causing millions of American and other school children to turn to Satanism struck a chord on the Christian right in the United States and the far right, where it was circulated widely as a true news story. So it started as a parody and then was believed by a lot of people. And it has since spawned a whole industry of attacks on Harry Potter, Hogwarts, J.K. Rowling, who felt compelled to issue a disclaimer in response, as well as to come out as a believing Christian, Rowling's publisher, and so on. But delving further into the genre problem, we may ask, what is the difference between fake news, a cover-up, and historical erasures? And an important question, which has greater impact. Is it fake news anytime a politician or a multinational company tells a lie, bends the truth, or neglects to mention information deemed to be bad for public relations? And what is the status of the many sensationalistic or supernatural rumors flying around the internet about ghosts, aliens, haunted houses, the dangers of vaccination, as well as about HIV/AIDS, Jews, Muslims, feminists, and so on, many of which were current long before the internet? Are they fake news, or are they merely traditional folk tales that have gotten a new lease on life? Finally, what is the role of partisan politics? What are we to make of the fact that far and away the best known self-styled debunker of fake news today is the American president-elect Donald Trump? And here on my PowerPoint, I had an image of one of his thousands of tweets criticizing what he calls fake news, which have then been retweeted hundreds of thousands of times by his followers. Fake news to Donald Trump seems to mean, to quote one scholar, credible reporting that Donald Trump doesn't like. And one feels compelled to ask, which definition of fake news is most likely to succeed? Donald Trump's version, or that of well-meaning liberal academics committed to discerning the truth? My own suspicion, particularly since the election, is that the term is now so tainted as to be almost unusable. And we'll be hearing all sorts of official statements about how Donald Trump really won the previous election and it was stolen to him by fakery and so forth. The recent post-truth revolution has begun to generate some interesting thinking about what truth and falsehood have meant historically, and how different kinds of falsehoods, but also false beliefs, intersect and interact. In this lecture, I apply some of this thinking to controversies related to the East India Company in the late 1600s. This might, at first glance, seem like a stretch. What does a mercantile company with a monopoly on trade in the East Indies have to tell us about truth and lies and the complicated terrain that divides them? Well, as I hope to show, rather a lot. And the reverse is also true. Thinking seriously about truth and lies can teach us to look at the 17th century and early globalization in some new ways. But to begin, we should probably dispense with the idea that the English, later British, East India Company was only a company. As Philip Stern and others have argued, the company was in effect a government, and Stern goes so far as to call it a company state. In Stern's words, and I'm quoting, the East India Company did what early modern governments did: erect and administer law, collect taxes, provide protections, inflict punishments, perform stateliness, regulate economic, religious, and civic life, conduct diplomacy and wage war, make claims to jurisdiction over land and sea, and cultivate authority over and obedience from those people subject to its command. Moreover, along with being a company state, that was the end of the quote. At least in its Asian holdings and in the wholly company-owned South Atlantic island of St. Helena, the East India Company was a very rich multinational corporation capable of wielding a lot of control. And yet, at the same time, the company retained its monopoly on Asian trade thanks to a charter from the English monarch, for which privilege it paid handsomely and often. And while the company would, after 1757, come to control increasingly large parts of South Asia, in the 17th century, its position was far more tenuous. In 1690, when this story begins, the company only controlled a couple of fortified coastal settlements, Bombay and Madras, today Mumbai and Chennai, and it maintained factories, i.e. trading establishments, often just a single building, in other coastal towns around South, Southeast, and East Asia, as well as the Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf, by virtue, and this is important, of agreements and permissions from a number of Asian monarchs and local authorities. In short, it was simultaneously a quasi-independent state, although a tiny one, and dependent upon the sufferance of other, often quite powerful states, most of which were non-European. At the same time, the company was deeply committed to turning a profit for its biggest stockholders and not overly particular about how that was done. This triple project of acting like a state, being beholden to a number of other states, many of them non-European, and being a profit-oriented multinational corporation, was not only challenging to manage, but it opened up the company to an enormous amount of criticism, both in Asia and in Europe. It also meant that the company was vulnerable both to lies and indeed to unpleasant truths, as well as conspiracy theories concocted by its enemies. At the same time, the company was highly motivated to engage in manipulating the truth in its own behalf. It was, in short, a nexus for all kinds of complicated maneuvers that speak centrally to the problems having to do with truth and falsehood. So let us start with conspiracy theories. Late in the year 1695, in the English East India Company settlement of Bombay, two men, one South Asian and one English, faced off across a yawning political and religious divide. We know of this tense meeting because of a detailed account written in Persian of one of the two, the Mughal historian and courtier Muhammad Hashim Kafi Khan. Relations between the Mughal authorities and the English East India Company were at a very low point at that time because of the recent capture by Henry Avery, an English pirate, of a large Mughal pilgrim ship named the Ganges Sawai on its return trip from Mecca. Avery's men, joined by the crew of several other pirate ships, set upon the Ganges Sawai in September of 1695 in the Arabian Sea, about 7 or 8 days' sail from its home port of Surat on the northwest coast of India. Surat was, as you will all know, the main Indian embarkation point for the annual Hajj, pilgrimage to Mecca, as well as the premier trading port in Mughal India. Having captured the Ganges Sawai, the pirates systematically looted it, then subjected the crew and passengers to days of torture from which many died, and in the case of the women pilgrims, some of whom were of the Mughal nobility, to gang rape. When news of the attack got back to Surat, it not surprisingly created outrage. Angry mobs attacked European trading houses, and the Mughal governor of the town had the entire English trading operation closed down and the English factors put in irons. For a time, it seemed as if the incident would lead to a resumption of the war that had divided the English East India Company and the Mughal Empire between 1685 and 1690, a war which today usually goes by the name of the First Anglo-Mughal War, and I'll be talking more about that war in a minute. And why it was of concern to the English was that it had culminated in a devastating 18-month siege of Bombay itself by the Mughal army. Now, not long after the Ganges Sawai incident, Kafi Khan arrived in Bombay, probably at the behest of the Mughal governor of Surat, who was anxious to resume trade. Kafi Khan was soon in conference with John Gayr, governor of Bombay, and the English East India Company's top official in India. With half of his employees sitting in chains in Surat, Gayr's central concern was to distance himself and the East India Company from the pirates, mainly by arguing that if these pirates were Englishmen and they had been heard to speak English among themselves by witnesses on the Ganges Sawai, if they were English, they could not possibly be employees of the East India Company, though he did think it possible that they might have been deserters from the company who had run from Bombay during the siege. Ever the courtier, Kafi Khan was gracious in the face of the governor's effort to deflect responsibility. But Kafi Khan's real view, recorded in his account of the meeting, was considerably harsher. According to him, Bombay, with its anemically low volume of trade and its sparse natural resources, nothing but betel nuts and coconuts, he scoffed, could not possibly have grown so rich except by profiting from piracy. And he thought he saw still worse motives at work. According to Kafi Khan, quote, the balance of the money required for the maintenance of the English settlement is obtained by plundering the ships voyaging to the house of God, that is Mecca, of which they take 1 or 2 every year. Their spies find out which ship bears the richest burden, and they attack it, and then presumably finance their settlement with it. To Kafi Khan, the actions of the English pirates, and especially their barbarous treatment of women pilgrims, was part of a more comprehensive pattern of deliberate Christian attacks upon the faith that the English East India Company pretended to deplore, but secretly directed and profited from. Now, Kafi Khan was not alone in thinking this. A petition of 1700 in Persian from 25 Surat merchants, clerics, and others to the Mughal government aimed at winning more compensation from the East India Company for ships taken by them during the late war makes essentially the same argument, but in a more secular form. According to the petitioners, the huge increase in piracy in the late 1690s was all perpetrated by the English East India Company. The petition concludes with the charge that, quote, the company of English have robbed and taken from several merchants of Surat ships and goods to the amount of 80 lakhs of rupees, and have committed several villainies aboard the respective ships taken by them, by which they have almost ruined the trade and port of Surat. Now, this was classic conspiratorial thinking. In 1694, or for that matter in 1700, the East India Company was not about to get into another imbroglio with the Mughal Empire. Incendiary behavior of the kind Avery's men, who really were pirates, had engaged in, were, from the company's point of view, catastrophic for trade. As it was, not only did the Ganges Sawai tragedy and similar seizures by European pirates cause huge headaches for the company, but fear of further retaliation by the Mughal state against the company helped generate a whole new approach to piracy on the part of the British state. And this is the process described in Robert Ritchie's wonderful book, Captain Kidd and the War Against the Pirates, which really shows the powerful and global impact of the threats of the Mughal state. On the other hand, as David Singh Gruel has put it in a very provocative essay on conspiracy theories in a networked and globalized world, quote, although conspiracy theories may be blunders, they are blunders that emerge in response to a particular ideological context. And so it was with the claim that the company was engaged in a covert policy of piracy. Kafi Khan was, as I have noted, a historian, and he was well aware that the Ganges Sawai episode had many precedents. European, primarily Portuguese, attacks on Muslim pilgrim ships coming to and from Mecca, as well as on other Indian Ocean shipping, or efforts to sell them protection licenses against being attacked, had been going on for 2 centuries. And from the beginning, these extortions were justified on the grounds that the ship's owners, crews, and passengers were, quote, outside the laws of Jesus Christ, end of quote. Later on, in the 17th century, the Dutch, English, French, and Danes also episodically pursued policies of attacking and looting Indian Ocean ships, usually as a way to achieve some tactical advantage over local rulers. And the company had done exactly that in its recent war with the Mughals. The company also played the religion card at almost every opportunity. At one level, the company had always been about trade and profits. It had never been interested in a crusade against Islam. But at the same time, the company often tried to stoke up religious prejudice at home in order to give itself a freer hand overseas. This is most famously reflected in the clause in the company's charter and in later letters of marque, which authorized it to wage war on foreign princes without royal assent, that is, without assent from the English king, quote, as long as those princes were not Christians, end of quote. But the company also sought to justify its monopoly by claiming that it was a bulwark of Protestant Christianity in distant and spiritually dangerous places so fraught with moral and commercial hazard that only well-armed ships and forts on the scale that the company alone could support could maintain some semblance of order. Thus, defenders of the company's monopoly routinely argued that Muslim and Hindu rulers were so dishonest and local Indian governors so venal that only a powerful company with an assured monopoly could keep them cowed enough to do any sort of honest trade. This claim was perhaps not a conspiracy theory per se, but it was rather flimsily tethered to the truth. The company also claimed to offer a defense against English traders becoming morally corrupted by the heathenish climate of South Asian trade, and either converting to Islam or transferring their allegiance to foreign or non-Christian powers, or both. All the European trading companies made arguments of this sort, and even if they were mainly tactical and mainly for the purpose of domestic consumptions back in their own home countries, they still had an impact. One group that absorbed that lessons was the pirates. A good many actual European pirates and would-be pirates in the era of the Ganges-Sawai attack, and there were many in the Indian Ocean in this period, European pirates, many of these people seem to have believed that they would be allowed to pursue their activities free of penalty, either on earth or presumably in heaven, as long as they confined their attacks to the ships of non-Christian nations. English pirates were still invoking this as a legal defense well into the second decade of the 18th century, even though by that time the argument lacked much purchase in the English law courts. So, for example, one English pirate, there are pirates from all over the place, Denmark, England, France. So one English pirate claimed during his criminal trial in 1696 that it was common knowledge among English sailors that, quote, it was very lawful to plunder ships and goods, etc., belonging to the enemies of Christianity, meaning Muslims. Another, who actually participated in the Ganges-Sawai attack, confessed before he was executed that he still felt guilt over the barbarous treatment meted out against, quote, the Moors and their ladies, although they were heathens. And I think the although is very powerful there. And the pirate Henry Avery himself tried to keep the English East India Company from coming after him by putting it about falsely that he had a policy of never attacking the ships of Christian nations. In short, while Kafi Khans and others claim that the company was masterminding pirate attacks and specifically targeting pilgrims was wrong, the story had, as we would say, a history. Like many conspiracy theories, and this is really Gruel's point, it aimed to make sense of the dispersed responsibility for events that is a common feature of globalization then and now. And it did so by fixing its sights on a single culprit, the company. A false diagnosis, yes, but hardly an unreasonable one. So let us turn to other contexts and other kinds of falsehoods. In India itself, the loyalty and obedience of its soldiers and sailors was a major problem for the English East India Company. Garrison at shipboard mutinies, as well as desertions, were common in the late 17th century, both en route and in Asia. Indeed, the company lost control of Bombay entirely for 11 months in 1683-84 as a result of a major garrison mutiny. That mutiny usually goes by the name of Kegwin's Rebellion in the history books. In response to crimes like these, the company deployed a range of methods, from executions to bribes, to win back the loyalty of its troops and discourage them from deserting. It also used more theatrical measures such as drums and trumpets, gun salutes, patriotic appeals, flags, loyalty oaths, and treating with alcohol in an attempt to build up esprit de corps. And of course, it also tried to appeal to a putative sense of racial and religious solidarity and superiority among its English, white, and mostly Protestant troops. Strategic appeals to some common identity against a foreign other are likely to be most effective when they strike a chord in the people they are trying to influence. So we might wonder what plebeian English soldiers and sailors themselves brought to this issue. How strong was their identification with Englishness, Protestantism, and whiteness? And did familiarity with foreign climes change their attitudes to any appreciable degree? We have some evidence about this in the form of a lengthy, though unfortunately largely unique, memoir by a mariner named Edward Barlow, who made at least 10 voyages from England to the East Indies and back between 1670 and his death in 1706. Though Barlow claimed to have gone to sea because he wanted to see the world and experience other people's customs, in fact, his memoir reveals a high level of paranoia about the many people he encountered in his travels. For instance, sailing along the coasts of Portugal and Spain in the 1660s, Barlow and his shipmates gave free rein to the reflexive anti-Catholicism they shared with so many 17th century English Protestants. And he writes in his diary, quote, "The people are all papists," meaning Catholics, "and many of them will kill Protestants for a very small affront and then run into their churches for sanctuaries," trying to say Catholics can kill Protestants and get away with it. This was when he was sailing by the Spanish port of Malaga. Muslims frightened him even more than Catholics, and he was especially worried about being enslaved by Barbary corsairs. He returns over and over in his memoir to the image of white Christians like himself being sold in the slave market, as he more than once put it, quote, "passed one to another like so many sheep." At least part of this fear was probably sexual. The popular literature on Barbary slavery and on Islam often harped on the theme of Christian youths being sold into homosexual slavery under the Turks or Moors. And this account comes from his first voyage when he was still in his teens. Especially worthy of note here is the fact that, as other sections of his memoir makes clear, Barlow found it completely reasonable to enslave some groups, i.e., Africans or Muslims, while being desperately afraid of being enslaved himself. And I mean, he actually considered going to the West Indies to become a slave plantation owner. This is a kind of double vision that one frequently finds in the early modern period. Barlow also harbored some rather more unexpected beliefs about difference. A case in point is the recurring theme in his writings of the other resorting to magic, especially magic aimed at controlling the weather. So, for instance, like many European sailors, Barlow believed that people from Scandinavian countries, and I'm giving this speech from a Scandinavian country right now, especially Scandinavian women, were uncommonly good at weather magic and prepared to use that power to revenge themselves on people who crossed them. Thus, Barlow attributes the fact that one of his ships was wrecked in 1675 on the Goodwin Sands, that was a lethal sandbar about 6 miles out from the coast of Kent. He attributes this to a curse laid upon the ship by a group of Norwegian landladies, furious because the men had shipped out of Bergen, Norway, without paying their lodging bills. He writes, quote, "We were bewitched by some of those devilish women that our men did owe money to, which was a common thing in them countries. For I have heard many times such things have happened." And you can see that he constantly channels rumor here. And frequently believes that particular rumors about magic. He also accused the people of the Barbary coast of using magic to generate storms. Quoting again, "The witches and soothsayers of Barbary bring up a foul wind," he complains, worried that this is part of a larger scheme to wreck the ship and send its crew into the North African slave markets. Once in India, his fear of malevolent weather magic grew more colorful and also more elaborate. Down on the Malabar coast, collecting a cargo of pepper, Barlow and his shipmates glimpsed a large bonfire burning on the shore, and almost simultaneously, their ship was hit by a violent thunderstorm. This convinced Barlow that he was witnessing Malabaris sacrificing their children to the devil, and that the devil had gotten offended at the paucity of the offering and raised the tempest as a punishment. Barlow's anxiety about Malabari weather magic stemmed partly from persistent rumors, some of them coming from the highest echelons of the East India Company, that Hinduism was a form of Satanism. But it also drew on European learned and folk discourses linking children, witches, child sacrifice, and devil worship. And it may even have links to the myth of Jewish ritual murder, which sort of combined all those things in a form that was very popular in the 16th and 17th century. And I might also note that in this case, all this weather talk proved prescient, for not very many years later, Barlow lost both his ship and his life in a storm off the coast of Mozambique. Barlow's memoir suggests a great deal about the complicated interface between elite efforts to build religious and racial solidarity in an embattled imperial context, really pre-imperial context, and pre-existing fears of difference, often of a supernatural kind. Barlow's stories of fear and difference are, of course, saturated with sensationalism. Child sacrifice, devil worship, conjurers, catastrophic weather events, portents, revenge, and death, which means that there are many surface parallels with the world of fake news today. Today, the taste for supernatural sensationalism is quite widespread. Much of it exists in its own clickbait universe, largely oblivious to politics. But it has also been colonized by right wing movements, particularly by those who proudly proclaim themselves to be post truth. There are surface similarities between company solidarity building and the xenophobia of many right wing populist movements, but there are also differences. One difference may be that in the 1660s, such fantasies enjoyed credibility across a quite wide social spectrum. Some English East India Company officials do seem to have believed that Hinduism was Satanism, and they also probably believed, and this is quite important for people like Barlow, that Hindu religious rituals had magical power. And I mean, that's really the point. If you're saying that some religion uh, is Satanism, what you're saying is that that religion has the power to move evil forces at a distance, so to speak. So those religions have the power to do magical things. It's not just that they're wrong, although they also believe that, but that they're wrong and they have real power. So this was what people still believed around 1670s. But by the end of Barlow's life in 1706, only about 35 years later, it had become increasingly unfashionable for educated elites, at least Western European ones, to believe that other religions' rituals, however dramatic, had any real magical efficacy. The last witches had been executed in 1682, and the judiciary, especially, was growing very dubious about supernatural causation. And as several historians have pointed out, the scientists tended to come rather later to skepticism than the lawyers, the lawyers were worried about proving this kind of causation in court. And that's one of the reasons they got skeptical earlier. However, the point is that once magical causation was known to be false, by elites anyway, elite efforts to deploy it to build solidarity and to hype up hatred of their enemies or just of people different from themselves would seem to fall easily into the fake news category if we're following the sort of making up and transmitting news stories known to be false, which of course is, in fact, the origin of quite a lot of fake news that we see today, though presumably not all of it. We do, though, I think, need to be careful about this formulation too, and this time for a different reason. Now, if we think about one of the more famous fake news stories of the 2000s, Pizzagate, which was a fake news hoax involving a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., allegedly used by Hillary Clinton to run a child sex slavery ring. I mean, that was the claim. It was largely the result of people on alt-right sites, 4chan and the like, cynically transmitting sensationalistic, supernaturally tinged news stories that they knew to be false, in this case for the purpose of demonizing Hillary Clinton. But at least one person believed it enough to storm the pizzeria with an automatic weapon. So, you get what you pay for, I guess. Plenty of similarly sensationalistic medieval and early modern stories worked because enough people believed them, including the people who started the rumors, to give them an impact in the real world. Take the demonstrably false myth of Jewish ritual murder, which I alluded to a second ago, which claimed that Jews were killing young Christian boys in order to use their blood for ritual purposes. In town after town in 14th and 15th century Europe, accusations of Jewish ritual murder, of children were made against leading Jews in the community. Severe torture was then used to extract so-called confessions, which in turn led to hundreds of executions, to pogroms, and to the expulsions of dozens of Jewish communities. With some notable exceptions, there seems little doubt that large numbers of Christians believe these stories, which are completely ridiculous if you know anything about the Jewish religion. And I mean, but despite being completely ridiculous, many people believe them, and plenty of other people seized upon them opportunistically. In light of this, is it really reasonable to focus so strongly on purposeful fakery when we're talking about the network myths of today? Or should we be looking at something else? Something like what the Columbia University intellectual historian Mark Lilla has called, quote, the lust for ignorance. I'll return to that in a second. But I want to move for my third and final case study to corporate cover-ups and returning again to the East India Company. Of course, cover-ups by multinational corporations are not new in the 17th century, and they're still with us today, though rules about transparency, especially when they are enforceable internationally, which often they're not, have begun to make a difference. The corporate cover-up I will focus on in the final section of this lecture began in 1690 when the English East India Company was almost brought down by an ill-considered war in India and regime change in the British Isles. Toward the end of the First Anglo-Mughal War, Bombay, the company's flagship settlement, was besieged for 15 hellish months, February 1689 to April 1690, by a Mughal general named Sidi Yakut Khan. In the course of this siege, the town was virtually flattened, and between 80 and 90% of the inhabitants, both Indian and European, died or fled. Things reached such a pass that company officials seriously considered abandoning the settlement, blowing up the fort, and departing for England in their remaining ships. And it's an interesting counterfactual what would have happened if they'd done that, and they really came within. They almost did it. They were so desperate. The siege was the final act in a war begun several years earlier by the company leadership in London. Top stockholders, including Josiah Child, the equivalent of the chairman of the board, saw the war as a way to pressure the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb to improve the company's terms of trade and crack down on English interlopers operating out of Mughal-controlled ports in defiance of the company's monopoly. And of course, I mean, a moment to say that the Mughals and Aurangzeb particularly didn't care at all about the company's monopoly, and why should they? The main English battle tactic was to use its heavily armed merchantmen to seize ships and cargo belonging to Mughal subjects, either in port or at sea. Relations between the company and the Mughals swiftly deteriorated as a result, and nowhere more than in the Mughal merchant city of Surat, a few days' sail from Bombay, where the ship seizures were regarded as acts of piracy. And the petition I mentioned earlier is a symptom of how badly this hurt the company's reputation in the long term. And what they were complaining about was some of the ship seizures that had happened during that war. Still, as late as January of 1689, there were hopes on both sides that some peaceful accommodation could be reached that would permit the resumption of trade. Then, on the 18th of that same month, January 1689, the English governor of Bombay, a man named John Child, who was no relation to the other Child, Josiah Child in London, made the fatal mistake of seizing a fleet of grain ships on their way to provision the Mughal army. Part of this army was at the time encamped about 40 miles down the road down the coast from Bombay, where Sidi Yakut Khan, an ally of the Mughal Empire, had a formidable island fortress. This is the well-known fortress, as some of you will know, of Janjira. A month later, Sidi Yakut Khan launched his assault on Bombay archipelago with between 6,000 and 14,000 men at their back. The Governor Child, was caught unprepared, outlying forts were precipitously abandoned, with valuable materiel and even stores of money left behind for Siddhi Yakut's army, and an unknown proportion of the population of Bombay town, including almost the entire town militia, fled to the mainland in small boats. The rest, a diverse array of merchants, textile producers, brokers, sailors, servants, and slaves, crowded into Bombay fort for safety. For the next 15 months, the civilians would share uncomfortable and increasingly unhealthy quarters with about 300 British and Indo-Portuguese garrison soldiers and 2,000 or so hastily obtained Indian mercenaries, mainly bought from the Marathas. Soon, food and cash ran low in the fort, epidemics broke out, including, late in the siege, the bubonic plague, morale plummeted, and desertions of soldiers and sailors, a problem even at the best of times, increased alarmingly. Over the course of the siege, 115 of the company's soldiers and sailors deserted, and almost all of them pledged loyalty to Siddhi Yakut. 67, or over half of these men, were English, and the rest, judging from the last names, were Portuguese or Portuguese Creole. In all, it appears that over a third of the original defenders deserted over to Siddhi Yakut Khan. And on top of this, at least half of the English deserters and an unknown number of the Portuguese also went so far as to convert to Islam. As we have already seen, the company worked hard to try to build solidarity among the English forces, in large part so as to stave off exactly the kind of wholesale defection that had occurred during the siege. Thus, one rather straightforward effort at building racial and national solidarity, and probably a popular one, was the company's policy of searching out and redeeming English subjects who had been imprisoned around the Indian Ocean littoral. Just find it. These were people who were in prison both for law breaking by parties looking for ransom money or less often by slavers. This mirrored the popular practice in England of collecting funds to redeem English slaves from the Barbary states of North Africa. And it was impelled partly by genuine fellow feeling among people from the same country, partly by the fact that it was good for the company's image, and partly by a desire to draw as clear a conceptual line as possible between the Christian and white English, who were free-born and hence could or should not be slaves, and others, Hindus, Muslims, people of African origin, who could. I mean, that's the kind of point of that exercise. The company also indulged in simple fear-mongering that both took advantage of and sought to reinforce a variety of existing rumors and theories about Muslims widespread among Christians, such as that Muslim princes were unusually cruel, dictatorial, and untethered to the rule of law, that Muslims were always seeking to enslave Christians, and that they had a strong preference for sodomy. This included playing to the superstitious fears of malevolent magic of people like the sailor Barlow. And it is worth noting that for Barlow, who had a love-hate relationship with the company, but who also ultimately stayed grudgingly loyal to it, this combination of practical benefits and outlandish claims, magical claims, probably were decisive. The siege itself threw up a host of new problems. For example, as the desertions mounted, the company adopted an explicit policy, at least it was explicit when writing to their superiors in London, of conserving the lives of Englishmen by deploying Indian troops on the more difficult and dangerous operations, and mainly sending in European troops as backup or to mop things up. They also tried to pay English soldiers before black ones, as they were meaning Indian ones, but had to backpedal on this and come up with the money when the Indian soldiers instantly mutinied. And there were 2,000 of them, so if they mutinied, there was nothing the English could do. Clearly, some of these expedients worked while others did not. However, speaking in the aggregate, the most powerful evidence for the limited success of the company's solidarity building measures around something like an English nationality, which would have encompassed skin color and place of birth, and at least aspirationally religion, was the large numbers of Europeans who deserted to the other side, in many cases, we've also seen, converting to Islam. What may have made it even more galling and a pointed repudiation of the company's attempt at race and religious based bonding was Sidi Yakut Khan's own background. The term Sidi, and a roughly synonymous term Habshi, meant African or Abyssinian, and Sidi Yakut Khan was one of a not inconsiderable number of persons of African descent who had ended up in the Indian subcontinent over the centuries, having come originally from the east coast of Africa. Many of these people carved out very successful careers in India, and Sidi Yakut himself had a string of notable military successes, was awarded a Mansab in the Mughal Imperial Army, and in 1677 received the title Admiral of the Mughal Navy. Though Sidi Yakut Khan's army never overran the fort, and they may never have intended to. I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence this whole operation was just intended to force the East India Company to stop taking other people's ships. Be that as it may, the company, outnumbered and with its forces dwindling by the day, was soon forced to sue for peace. The English were in hopes that they would receive trade concessions as part of any peace deal, and the Mughal negotiators apparently encouraged this belief. This peace attempt to make a peace deal lasted a very long time, and there were rumors. I mean, this is a very Aurangzeb type story, but there were rumors that the English envoys were forced to appear before Aurangzeb on their knees with their hands chained behind their backs, which, very Aurangzeb story, but which may or may not be true. But what is certainly true is that the English were very much at a disadvantage, and they were willing actually to do almost anything to get the siege lifted. However, when the emperor finally offered the lifting of the siege and the farman, the Persian order that marked the official peace, arrived and was translated, East India Company officials were appalled to discover that it offered no trade benefits at all and that the tone was insulting in the extreme. The farman stressed the large indemnity payment the company had to promise to make, berated the company for its bad behavior in starting the war, and ordered the banishment of company governor John Child. Fortuitously, of course, he'd already died. In sum, instead of treating the company officials like dignitaries of a foreign nation with their own independent settlement, which was how the company liked to think of Bombay, the farman addressed them as if they were disobedient minor feudatories who needed to be cut down to size. Now, the company tried its best to keep the humiliating farman a secret, but a disgruntled employee, of which there were many, leaked an English translation to the London press, to the delight of the company's enemies in the British Isles. The company was already vulnerable after the English Revolution of 1689 because it was so closely linked politically to the deposed James II. Now, its failed and dishonorable secret war, the folly of which the farman seemed only to confirm, the apparent incompetence of its servants in India, and a string of other supposed excesses emboldened its critics. In the 1690s, the company came within a hair of being permanently dissolved by the king and parliament. In fact, the public relations crisis that the siege of Bombay helped to precipitate stands as one of the lowest moments in the entire 274-year history of the East India Company, and arguably much more significant than the Hastings scandal 100 years later. Even before the siege of Bombay, the company was concerned with damage control. In fact, from the very start, it was quite cagey about the fact that it had instigated a war in distant India. And in 1689, while the siege of Bombay was still going on, Sir Josiah Child, the mastermind of the original war and the company's largest stockholder, went so far as to publish a fictitious peace treaty, which, according to him, was on the verge of being signed by the Mughals. And in my PowerPoint, I have an image of this fake peace treaty. What it purported to show was that by resorting to arms, the company had achieved a huge array of concessions from the Mughals that put them ahead of every other trading company in India, all of which was to the, quote, eternal honor of the English nation, end of quote. The alleged treaty was, of course, a figment of Josiah Child's very fertile imagination, a very clear case of fake news. And when you compare it with what was really happening, it's really pretty striking. What you can get away with when it's 4,500 kilometers away. Though the company paid dearly in the court of public opinion for its war in India, and people with an interest in the issue knew in very general terms what had happened in Bombay, even English people, it is curious that more was not made of the siege by the company's English critics. One reason was that very few details about the siege got out into the public eye in England. And part of the reason for this was that hardly any of the company's ships made it back home during the 14 months of the siege, or indeed for many months after it. The company's directors in London probably first got the bad news of Sidi Yakut Khan's invasion late in 1689, but they certainly did not widely advertise it. And once the siege was over, the company tried to download the destruction of the town, which was pretty much total, and to claim that the high death rates were almost all the result of the plague, not of actions by Sidi Yakut's army, and would therefore have happened anyway. The company's attempts to explain away the whole affair was made somewhat easier by the fact that people in England were preoccupied by the Revolution of 1689 and the ensuing war with the French. But it also benefited from the fact that almost all the eyewitnesses to the tragedy at Bombay died there. Between 80 and 90% of the townspeople, as I said earlier, did not survive the war, which meant that there were actually very few people to come home and tell about it. The siege would have looked even more embarrassing than it already did if the full details had been widely known. There had been a hostile exchange of letters with Sidi Yakut about his grain ships, Governor Child failed to take proper precautions against an invasion or even to get in extra supplies. This, coupled with the fact that the company had to hire 2,000 Indian mercenaries at great cost to defend its fort against Sidi Yakut Khan's troops, suggested that its top people, both in London and in India, were incapable of managing trade and the use of force simultaneously, which was always one of the main arguments for the East India Company monopoly. That's why military setbacks for the company are always such a big issue, because their claim is that they can manage trade and the use of force simultaneously. Finally, the desertion conversion problem suggested either that English soldiers were thoroughly unreliable, which was a blow to national pride and contemporary notions of masculine valor, as well as to Christian sensibilities, or that the company was an incompetent authority hated by its own servants. It also hit at another of the company's claims that Asian trade needed to take the form of a controlled monopoly under a royally chartered company, because absent such a governing body, English people in Asia would convert in large numbers to Islam. And one simply does not know what the English public would have made of the fact that Sidi Yakut Khan was of African descent, though it is telling that this was one of the moments when the transatlantic slave trade, which would end up by transporting about 12 million Africans to the Americas, was starting to truly take off in this period, along with arguments about that Africans were natural slaves. I mean, the typical sort of Aristotelian argument. Perhaps nothing would have been made of it, or perhaps given Sidi Yakut's conspicuously superior military skills and charisma, and the fact that the company's main man in Bombay, John Child, was an unlikable person with no military experience, could have turned the whole thing into quite a big issue. What the East India Company finally wanted people to think about the Siege of Bombay is best seen in an account by an Anglican clergyman named John Ovington, published in 1696 under the title A Voyage to Surat in 1689. Ovington made a 4-month visit to Bombay, beginning on 29th May 1690, which was only a month after the ceasefire had been declared and before all of Sidi Yakut Khan's forces had left the island. And apparently Ovington refused to leave his ship because he was worried about catching the plague, which was a pretty widespread in Bombay at the time. But or in the fort, which was the only place left in Bombay. So anyway, he was in his fort, in his ship, watching essentially Sidi Yakut Khan's forces being rowed away from the island. The book appeared at a decent interval of 6 years from the siege itself, and in 1697, Ovington was voted £25, which was a lot of money in 1697, by a grateful East India Company court as a reward for writing it. So they liked very much what he had to say. Ovington represented the war in India very much as the company wanted to think of it, as a just war that had stemmed from broken promises on the part of the Mughals, and especially from the, quote, despotic proceedings of greedy Mughal customs officials. Even the company's controversial seizures of Mughal ships are reduced in Ovington's account to, quote, some small disputes at sea, end of quote, an understatement that has the effect of deflecting attention from the fact that the company had initiated the war. It also made Sidi Yakut's invasion look like an act of unprovoked Mughal aggression. There is much that one could say about the way Ovington's account tweaked or misrepresented the truth in order to bolster the company's image. For instance, Ovington makes no direct mention of the fact that most of the fort's defense force was made up of Indians. In his account, the English soldiers fought alone and so valiantly that, quote, for some months, Sidi Yakut Khan's army was unable to approach the fort, end of quote. Interestingly, Ovington does refer to the desertion problem, but he does not, of course, acknowledge how extensive it was. No mention is made of the ignominious famine, and there is only glancing mention of the destruction and loss of life. And recall that there was basically nothing left of Bombay by the time Ovington arrived there. Whether they admired Sidi Yakut Khan or detested him, most people, whether English, Portuguese, Mughal, or Maratha, were fascinated by his intelligence, courage in battle, and personal charisma. Ovington alone seems to have been unmoved and uninterested. That is to say that he tells us absolutely nothing about Sidi Yakut Khan beyond the fact that he fought for the Mughal emperor. Ovington almost certainly, because he was sitting in his ship, almost certainly witnessed Sidi Yakut's soldiers being ferried past the fort on their way back to the mainland. Contemporary reports talked of the English deserters who were also being ferried away, leaning over the sides of the boats, loudly mocking their former comrades for staying with the losing side. Yet remarkably, Ovington ascribes the end of the conflict to, quote, the city being beaten off the island, a statement he certainly knew to be an abject lie. Clergyman, what can you say? Later, Ovington spent many pages lauding the good order, personal virtue, conspicuous godliness, and honorable reputation of the company's factory in Surat, as well as defending the rational necessity of its servants maintaining a very high level of luxury expenditure for the, quote, honor of the English nation, end of quote. In his portrayal, the company was esteemed as much or more by the Mughals after the war with the Great Mughal, after the First Anglo-Mughal War, as they had been before it, a story neither Asian nor European sources support. Covington's account of his visit to Bombay at the tail end of the siege was as detailed as anyone loyal to the company ever got about the siege in print. In the end, by a combination of luck and guile, the company succeeded just in convincing most people that the siege of Bombay was of small significance, a distant bad dream that in no way conflicted with its claim to embody the only workable way to organize trade to the East Indies. And so the siege swiftly dropped from view, even at a time when the company's enemies were actively on the lookout for any damaging material they could find. What lessons can be learned from resurrecting an event like the Siege of Bombay, one that has essentially been erased from history? Certainly, the story of the siege and the larger First Anglo-Mughal War supports recent attempts to show that European imperial expansion was less triumphal than used to be thought. The case of the Siege of Bombay helps us to resurrect some of the error, failure, and despair, to echo Alison Games, that was stricken from the historical record, both at the time and later, in the interest of presenting a cleaner, less embarrassing, more patriotic, and more imperial story. In addition, the war and siege point to the limits of the company's state-building project, among other things, showing how quickly the Mughal army could turn into a serious rival for the loyalties, spiritual and otherwise, of lower-level company military personnel, including Englishmen. These men were experiencing the draw of an integrative system, the gigantic Mughal army, whose center was South Asian rather than European, and which radiated out very far indeed. The story of the Siege of Bombay forces the historian to take account of other processes of global integration, overlapping at points with European-led systems, but with a magnetism and a sphere of influence all their own. The company's largely successful cover-up of the severity and implications of the Siege of Bombay, and its efforts to either discredit or ignore the Indian protagonists, whether the Emperor Aurangzeb, the Marathas, who supplied, as I said, most of the hired Indian soldiers the English used to try to repel Siddhi Yakut, other Indian soldiers in its temporary employ, or Siddhi Yakut Khan himself, were primarily aimed at protecting its already battered reputation in England. But it was also an instance of the relative ease with which distant systems, global in their own right, can be minimized or simplified. It is also a salutary reminder that fake news or false news, which in this case is all about historical erasures, can have big implications for our understanding of both the past and the present. To conclude, today I have discussed three different sets of untrue stories. In the first, I examined a conspiracy theory apparently widespread on the northwest coast of India in the 1680s and beyond that held the English East India Company responsible for a rash of acts of piracy by Europeans in the Indian Ocean, and that also shaded into the claim that the company was engaged in a war against Islam. In the second, I explored the sensationalist imagination of a 17th century English sailor and the way his fears about both the temporal and supernatural powers of Muslims and Hindus, and Norwegians and North Africans, meshed with the East India Company's efforts to promote loyalty among its employees. In the third, I analyzed the East India Company's own efforts to cover up, massage, and outright lie about a war it instigated in the 1680s with the Mughal Empire. What does all this point to? Let me just mention one or two things, and I hope we can talk about some others into the discussion. One thing they point to is the complicated relationship between information, both true and false, and the maintenance of authority, a project that is also tied closely both to honor and to political survival. This can be clearly seen in the East India Company's desperate efforts to spin the news with respect to its failed war against the Mughals, with all its embarrassing corollaries, from being defeated by an African warlord to having its flagship settlement destroyed to having many of their employees desert and convert to Islam. Another theme that appears in several of the stories is the long-standing relationship between loyalty building and attempts to undermine the humanity of the other through highly sensationalistic and supernatural stories. These stories would be unbelievable in most contexts, but they do useful work in certain ideological contexts, as they continue to do today. Still, as the failure of the company to hold on to its employees during the siege shows, they were certainly not fail-safe. Racism and ethnocentrism are not always sufficient to paper over the failures or the programmatic weaknesses of the authorities or those who aspire to authority. On the other hand, the case I began with also shows one of the ways people trying to resist power, in this case, resistance to the East India Company by Surat mercantile elites, can turn untrue stories to their benefit, especially stories that may grossly simplify the situation but have some warrant in past history. Though this lecture has talked about a variety of approaches to truth and falsehood, its intent is not to imply that the truth is merely relative. The East India Company really was not promoting piracy in the late 1690s. Rather, it was desperately trying to stamp it out because it was afraid of what the Mughals would do if the problem of piracy was not solved. Edward Barlow's lurid fantasies about Norwegians, Catholics, Muslims, and Hindus had occasional flashes of rationality. The Barbary states were enslaving sailors in the 17th century, just as Christian powers in the Western Mediterranean were enslaving subjects of the Ottoman Empire. But mostly, they were sensationalistic and racist canards. And the East India Company did construct an elaborate fabric of lies and misinformation about the siege of Bombay, and we have plenty of other evidence about what really happened to prove it. There is truth to be found, but it often takes some work. That is why it is important to resist the impulse to just stop caring about the truth. When people just start listening to whomever has the loudest voice or the most followers, we are in trouble as a world. Ignorance is not bliss. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for this astonishing lecture and for this. It's a wonderful lecture, ma'am, and we learned a lot from this. So now we will start our Q&A section. So if anybody have any question, so they can ask in the chat box, or else we will take some questions from our YouTube channel. So I will take one question from YouTube if they have any question. So Aditya Shankar Chattopadhyay asked a question. That is,
I'm not seeing. Could you read it to me, because my messages are not showing?
Yes, ma'am. I'm reading out this question.
Okay, great.
Asking that how can Foucault's concept of biopower and disciplinary mechanism be applied to the British East India Company's use of disinformation in shaping colonial governance and control over populations?
What do you mean by biopower? I mean, I know it in the 20th century, but in the 17th century? Do you mean it in terms of control of bodies? I mean, if you mean it sort of in just a basic Foucauldian sense, I mean, they certainly use physical discipline, both against mutineers, slaves. They execute a couple of slaves because they consider them to be mutinous. So, physical punishment is certainly a big part of how they try to govern. I mean, biopower is such a general term, so Do you want to clarify a little bit what you mean by it in this context?
Though it's YouTube, so we can't communicate with who asked this question. So it's a barrier.
Okay.
So we will take another question if there is a problem with it. So next question is asked by Mariam Begum. She's asking that how did British East India Company leverage disinformation to construct epistemic hierarchies that justified its colonial project?
In the 1670s, 80s, I think it's actually, and there's a lot of discussion about this, as I'm sure many of you know. I mean, was it really a colonial project in the late 17th century, or is it primarily a trading project that that turns into something else several decades later? I mean, I think that there's certainly an ambition on the part of some people in the East India Company Directorate, like Josiah Child, to be something more than just a trading company. And I had actually in my PowerPoint a famous sort of seal of the East India Company from 1670, which it has in Latin "diffusus in orbe," diffused across the world, which some people have seen as a kind of manifesto for expansion. But as other people have pointed out, I mean, what it really means is that they want to trade as widely as possible, not particularly to set up um, colonial settlements, which are expensive, difficult to administer. I mean, they have endless difficulties administering even the tiny settlements of Bombay and Madras. So I mean, I'm not sure if this is really where you're getting at, but I think in the 1670s, it's hard to see this as part of a fully formed colonial project. I mean, that is not to say that they don't invoke racism, ethnocentrism, as I've been describing in this talk, but I think. I mean, my belief, and I know that this is a debate, my belief is that when you're really getting a ambition to have large scale territorial control is much later than this. But and I mean, the whole story of the siege of Bombay shows you how weak these people were. I mean, they did not have massive military resources. They had, and I mean, Governor Child was truly an idiot, as many people said at the time. Um, seizing the Mughal army grain stores when you're talking about an army of somewhere like in the vicinity of 900,000 people. I mean, it's just stupid. So I don't know exactly if that's where you want to go with that, but that would be my sense of what things were like in the 1670s, 1680s. They definitely changed later on.
Thank you, ma'am, for this answer. So I'll take another question. Bimol Shomadar is asking one question that the company often used fabricated narratives to delegitimize Indian rules and social structures. How did these narratives serve its economic objectives, and how do they align with Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony in the establishment of consent for exploitative practices?
Well, again, this looked really different in the later 18th century and into the 19th century than it did in the 1670s, 1680s. I mean, I think that what they were doing, and I mean, all of the European trading companies did this. and not just European trading companies, by the way. It's sort of a common refrain of merchants everywhere that they're not being sufficiently well treated by whoever the local ruler is. Now, some local rulers, particularly in Southeast Asia, went to some trouble to create favorable business environments for traders, but an awful lot of them just tried to take them for whatever they could get. To collect protection money, collect large customs, and so forth. So some of this is just what you hear from all trading companies. I mean, if you talked to Yemeni traders, you would hear the same kind of thing. But I think that the Europeans particularly tended to focus on religious difference. So, and also racial, alleged racial differences that and you can see this all around the world, certainly not just in South Asia. I mean, they were forever complaining about the problems of trading with Africans, or the problems of trading with the Persians, or whoever it is, and I think it's partly again for domestic consumption back in back in Great Britain, where they can say, "Oh, we failed on this because of the because of the lies and cheating behavior of this local ruler." And I mean, in a way, it's the cost of doing business, but it's very handy to have those sorts of excuses around if you are having to explain failures or drops in profits or whatever it is to your stockholders at home. And I think that this is a really important issue in multinational corporate management, even more than it is in sort of independent settlements, that with multinational corporations, then as now, you have this group of people who are putting the capital forward, and you need to explain to them why their capital is not resulting in the profits that you promised them. And at that point, all kinds of racist arguments about local rulers and whomever become very useful. And they also play to the existing assumptions of company of armchair travelers back at home.
Thank you, ma'am. We will take one last question asked by Arnav Rokhit. He asked that the British East India Company operated at the intersection of mercantilism and emerging capitalism. How did its disinformation practices reflect the ideological underpinnings of early capitalism? Can its strategies be viewed as precursors of the corporate manipulation of truth in neoliberal economies today?
Maybe. I mean, there's a way in which manipulations of the truth are actually pretty simple. I mean, you kind of say the opposite of what's really happening, and then you try to marshal fake evidence to support that. So, in some ways, building up a lie in the 17th century is not so different from building up a lie today. I'm not sure how much it has to do with mercantilism or capitalism. I mean, the East India Company is by definition a kind of mercantilist project. Monopolies are a form of mercantilism, even though later on many multinational corporations. I mean, I was just thinking the other day about United Fruit, a famous multinational that had all kinds of horrific implications for various countries in South America. They often try to set up monopolies, and they often try to influence local politics to their benefit. I guess I'm not sure there's a massive difference between the way mercantilist operations do this and sort of neoliberal capitalist ones, partly because, well, as Adam Smith said, companies are always trying to create monopolies, even in a neoliberal context. And they're probably always trying to manipulate the truth for the purposes of their stockholders, which I think is one reason why corporate transparency measures are actually kind of important. Not that they always work, and distance. I mean, I think that the story that I've been telling today really shows you how distance offers all kinds of opportunities to multinationals to massage the truth. But again, I mean, what they're actually doing, truth and lies are not so complicated, really. Turning the truth into a lie is not such a complicated thing, and I'm not sure the particular reigning economic system of the moment is the most significant thing. What may be significant is its globalized character, which does set up a whole bunch of different variables. Religious and national difference, just distance. I mean, the fact that people often don't think or like to think about things that are happening far away. I mean, all of those things can play a role. So I would say the global element, the globalization element, is probably more significant, and the sort of simplistic character of truth and lies at the most fundamental epistemological level, I think maybe the most significant things here.
Thank you, ma'am. So if anybody has any other questions, so they can ask in the chat box. And if not, so we will close our session. And again, thank you, ma'am, for joining us today. It's a very wonderful lecture, and we learned these kind of areas. We learned a lot from this session, ma'am. So if anybody
Well,
has any other questions.
Thank you very much for having me and for excellent questions.
I think, okay, ma'am, it's done. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Goodbye.